Good morning to all of you. Many thanks for attending this author mixed critic session on book migration and the search for a home. This is, on one hand, a discussion session on a book. So it's basically for the author of the book, in this case for myself, a gift, so that some colleague were so nice to take some time to read it, to make comments. So all sorts of criticism are just a gift I get from someone else. So I'm very happy in the first place for that only. At the same time, it is to me a way of advancing the debate on a question that is the significance of home along the life trajectories of migrants and the contribution of a homeland to understand it. That is a question that resonates to a variety of debates of social sciences and can be of interest to a number of colleagues in migration studies and beyond that. So I think there is a merit, a potential in this session well beyond the discussion of a monograph as such. Two things very quickly on the book, and then I just leave the floor to the participants. My idea with this book was to do something that, on the one, in a sense, is nothing new. Home, whatever we define and understand it, is something absolutely common in the background of most people, including ourselves, including international migrants. There is, however, a merit, I believe, and particularly for migrants, in foregrounding it, in bringing to the fore, in specifically unpacking through analysis what tends to be natural, what tends to remain in the everyday domain of the tacit, of the taken for granted, of the background. All the more so because the life condition of displaced people, of migrants, of a number of vulnerable people does highlight the significance of home, possibly for the lack of it or for the search for it anew. There have been so many interesting singular case studies on what home means, on the circumstances of migration over the last decades, spanning across the boundaries between anthropology, sociology, geography, political sciences, and so forth. There have been fewer attempts, I believe, to map them conceptually in a single framework, as I am trying to do with this book. I have first an introductory chapter which maps the literature on home in light of the variety of views and stances that have arisen around it across social sciences, and of the ways of telling house, dwelling, and home, with particular attention to the interaction between descriptive and normative aspects of it. All that we frame as home as both a descriptive side and an ideal prescriptive one, which makes it more complex but possibly still more interesting as a topic for research. The book then includes a methodological chapter, sketching out some ways of doing research on all that home means in practice for international migrants. It then tries to navigate across the pre-existing literature, both in terms of space and time, all that has to do with home as not only a matter of speciality, of telling some special place from all the others, but also a matter of temporality, and all the more so for migrants. The book ends up then with a chapter on the political side of home. Part of what makes it interesting as a topic here, I believe, is that home is not only, in the literal sense of the term, an issue of dwellings, of domestic space, but it's also a powerful channel and venue for claims making, for drawing boundaries between members and non-members, between insiders and outsiders, and potentially a powerful lever for exclusionary forms of policy making too.
Okay, so yeah, let me start with some praise, because I think it's well deserved. I really loved reading the book, and I especially enjoyed the focus on home as processual and as relational, which is, in my view, a radically anti-essentialist approach that is especially in the here and now of the greatest importance, especially because of the rise of the populist and far right that base their political discourse precisely on essentialist conceptions of home, discourses that are grounded in nativist and racialized conceptions of migrants as destabilizing native populations' sense of home and place, autochthonous European sense of home and place. So I appreciate your perspective very much, homing as a process, not home as an essence. And there's not much in the book that I actually disagree with, but so it was difficult to sort of think what I was going to say. But I do have a number of issues that are not per se critical of the book, but they might help us think about future research on this question. So in my response, I will shift a little bit the attention from migrants' practices of homing to the question of nativism and racism, which is more my field. Understanding nativism and racism, of course, as fundamental to the ability and agency of migrants to engage in processes of homing, and the ability of migrant and post-migrant communities, increasingly racialized and minoritized in the current political climate in Europe, to find a sense of agency in the construction of home and of belonging in more general terms. In my own research, my focus has been on autochthonous perceptions of migrant alterities, or native perceptions of migrant alterity. And I analyzed this culturalization of citizenship, as we've called it, in the Netherlands from a critical and ethnographic perspective. And the concept gives name, the concept of the culturalization of citizenship gives name to the rise of a discursive genre, an interpretive frame that carves up Dutch society in distinct, internally homogeneous and delimited cultures, and that represents autochthonous Dutch culture as a threatened entity that must be protected against the allegedly deviant cultures and moralities of minoritized and racialized outsiders. And the culturalist discourse then rests on the construction of a symbolic front, a boundary, between autochthonous insiders and so-called newcomers, who continue to be seen, to use the term of pouvoir, as space invaders or guests in a national home, right? So they're always outsiders, and they're always destabilizing the sense of home of those who really belong. So this culturalist logic, which is intimately tied up with right-wing populist rhetoric, the right-wing conception of home that you see emerging here is deeply essentialist. It is not seen as something dynamic. The sense of home is not seen as something dynamic, something that people can sort of, engage with and acquire, but as an essence that is destabilized by migration and by the perceived cultural alterity of others with a capital O. So central to the process of culturalization is the mobilization of culture as an integral whole, a static totality, and the symbolic equation of social groups with a particular ethnos and with a reified culture. The culturalist common sense is based on the idea that Dutch, or more broadly European culture, should be dominant on Dutch or European soil and should be defended against the cultures of deviant outsiders. The dominant Dutch culture is to assimilate minorities into the fictive body we call society, which is conceived of as an integral totality with a discrete, monolithic cultural substance. And in Jan Willem Duivendack's terms, the culturalist ideal is a homogeneous national home. So there we have the concept of home again. So in the context of the Netherlands, I'm afraid this conception of home, this culturalist conception of home, if you want, has become dominant, not per se hegemonic, because there's still some discursive space for alternative narratives, but dominant for sure, which affects the possibilities of migrants to construct a sense of home, it seems to me. The notion of culture as a distinct totality or a home, culture as home, constitutes a conception of culture that is troubling from the anthropological perspective that I come from. Reified cultural frameworks ignore precisely the relational, processual, and conflictual character of human worlds making, or if you want, home making. It simplifies reality by creating an illusion of cultural unity, reducing the minoritized other to a knowable and perceivable essence. Culturalism constitutes a discourse that equates ethnic categories with social groups under the name of community and identifies each community with a reified culture. And there was a quote by Gerd Baumann. Moreover, the culture ascribed to minorities has increasingly become framed as explanatory of social problems of persons in minoritized social groups, including persistent socioeconomic marginalization and allegedly deviant attitudes and behavior. This in turn points to a naturalization of culture. Those defined as ethnic minorities are seen to form a community based on their reified culture, and their culture must appear in reified form because they are, after all, identified as a community, which is another quote by Gerd Baumann. So, culturalization must always denote some form of naturalization. And the late Gerd Baumann's critique of essentialist and totalizing conceptions of culture and the alternative he formulates is illuminating and deserves attention. Baumann advocates an understanding of culture as a triple helix in perpetual motion. Culture, he argues, always has to strike new balances among three factors: changing material circumstances, changing motivations and cognitive structures, and changing patterns of action and behavior. And I think there's some resonance here with your conception of home, right? The three elements of this triple helix, as he calls it, constantly act upon the other. So change is the key word here, and culture is always in motion. It is not an essence, but a process. And this understanding of culture as a perpetuum mobile, as dynamic, processual, and historical, is at odds with the substantialist, organicist, and nativist use of culture in common sense culturalist discourse, which construes culture as home. So your work points to these dynamics, obviously. However, I'm wondering if a bit more focus on the structural and institutional environment could be useful here. In the context of the rise of the exclusionary populist right and the normalization of ever stricter integration and assimilation discourses, how are migrant populations expected to engage in practices of homing? It is here that I am a bit critical, if you want. In your book, there's no explicit engagement with the question of racism. I actually sort of looked up the word, it's not there. There's no this is a constructive engagement. There's no explicit engagement either also with the fact that migrants and their children and grandchildren continue to be construed, as I said, as space invaders, as newcomers, as not really belonging. And I would like to stress the extent to which nativist perspectives of home, now normalized in a country like the Netherlands, for instance, but in many European countries, affect the practices and capabilities of migrant populations to feel at home, to engage in processes of homemaking. I point, for instance, to the important work done by my colleague Sinan Chankaya. Is he here? No, he will speak tomorrow. Who will, on ethnic profiling and everyday forms of racism that migrant youth have to deal with on a daily basis. There's some literature suggesting that in the context of the normalization of nativism, the city is a refuge. People with migrant background might have an easier time identifying with their city than with the nation state they are expected to identify with. But when we take a close look at the everyday experience of black and brown youth in European cities today, we see that the city is also a space of exclusion and securitization, processes that affect migrant communities in disproportionate terms, obviously. So, not to mention, and this is sort of my bridge from race to the class-race nexus, gentrification. While I agree with you that the concept of home is different from the concept of house, it seems to me it is crucial to take into account the neoliberal transformation of our main cities in Europe today. Processes of gentrification, exclusion, displacement that make it harder and harder for people to remain where they are, to find a place, to engage in homemaking. The flexibilization of the labor market and the flexibilization of the housing market leads to a situation in which temporary is the new permanent, right? This is true for people's jobs, but it is also increasingly true for people's housing situations. Precarity at the labor market goes hand in glove with precarity in dwelling and living circumstances. Temporary contracts are increasingly defining people's lives, both in the labor market and in the housing market. There's no doubt at all that this situation disproportionately affects people with migrant background. In that sense, the condition of displacement and social insecurity is becoming the new normal, by the way, not only for migrant populations, but also for many working class European white people. One last point I would like to make, so that's the first part of my, and then a small other point that I would like to make concerns the relationship between the question of home and the question of social reproduction. So I have been profoundly influenced by the recent re-emergence, you could say, of social reproduction theory. See, for instance, the book by Titi Bhattacharya, I hope I pronounced that right, Social Reproduction Theory, Remapping Class, Recentering Oppression. This body of work provides a materialist understanding of the family, and I would also argue, we could say, of the home, as central to the production of docility, the reproduction of labor, the reproduction of society in general. And someone like Sara Fariz, in her work on femonationalism, she was going to be here actually, but she's sick, unfortunately, otherwise she would have been speaking this afternoon. But Sara Fariz has pointed to the central role played by migrant labor in contemporary neoliberal capitalism, especially the migrant labor of women, and especially the role migrant women play in taking care of children, in making homes, in processes of homing, in other words, often not their own homes, and especially I feel that we are, sorry, I lost my way there, but I feel that we are talking about homing in relation to migrant communities. If we are talking about that, we also need to take into account the social reproduction work, the care work that is being done by migrant women in contemporary European societies. They offer cheap labor that is nonetheless essential to processes of homing and homemaking in contemporary Europe. All that said, I think the book is wonderful, and I'm looking forward to discussing these issues in the future. Thank you for the chance to participate in this panel.
Thanks very much, Paul. Christine Barwick, please.
Thank you. Well, thanks also for giving me a chance to discuss your book. I actually wrote a review, so Paolo already knows what I think about the book. And the introduction could be the same. It was, I enjoyed reading the book, and it's hard to be a critic of a book where actually you think, yes, this is true, and that's what we have to do. So I will give a few comments and tell you about some of the ideas I had when reading the book. Small criticism. Well, what I like about the book is this idea of homing being a process. So Paolo says in his book that making a home is the process of attaching a sense of home that migrants have felt in the previous place to a new place. And in the book, what you stress a lot is that, yes, home is not static, homing is a process, etc. But what I felt was when talking about the previous home, that the previous home was mostly implicitly thought as something positive, that actually people had an idea of home, a sense of home that they wanted to reattach. And say home is the social relationship, and it's characterized by security, by familiarity and control. And I think we can imagine many situations in which the previous home did not have all those characteristics. So what I'm wondering a little bit is, should we be a little bit more critical what the previous sense of home was? Was it actually positive? Would immigrants want to reattach the sense of home, or are they really looking for something else? And where the sense of home is probably, not a positive one, obviously, is for refugees. And when I thought about refugees, I had many different ideas or thoughts about home and what I find in Germany at the moment, and this is particular, it's concerning these ideas of what is important for home. Again, security, familiarity, and control. And I wondered a little bit in what relation do they stand to each other, how important is one more important than the other. And in Germany, as in other European countries, there are these national distribution policies. And in Germany, you have many stories where refugees actually have to settle in small towns, very often also in East Germany, mostly places that haven't had a lot of experience with diversity through migration. And on the one hand, there are tons of newspapers. I think there will also be a lot of research coming out soon. What you read in these accounts is that on the one hand, familiarity is actually easy to establish because you get to know people very quickly because it's in a small place. And even if these people were more prejudiced or had stereotypes about those Muslim refugees, they actually realize quickly that, okay, those are just normal people like ourselves. So it's easy to fit in and to find contact. At the same time, what you also hear is that what's missing are relationships to people from the same place. So that's why they finally move back to large cities as soon as they have the chance. So this is an interesting thing to wonder about. What is most important? Is it security, familiarity, control? How do they interact? Also, as we're talking here mostly about immigrants, what is also interesting that through the immigration of refugees, that other ethnic groups who have been in the country for a longer time might actually more feel at home. And I recently talked to someone from France, where Tunisians were very often seen as the bad immigrants. But they are French, they have been there for generations. They have the second, third generation. But since the refugees came, France didn't take in a lot of refugees, but the refugees are mostly from Sudan, Congo, and they look different. They really have dark skin, and so they are very visible. And suddenly, these are becoming the new immigrants that have to be looked at with suspicion, and the previous immigrants, like Tunisians, nobody cares about them anymore. So actually they now have the chance to feel more at home. So there is kind of a hierarchy of migrants, of ethnic minorities. Now, when reading the book, I asked myself many of the questions that were raised. How would they look for the second generation? Because as Paolo knows, I'm very much focusing on the second generation in my research. And there, first of all, I'm thinking about the scales of home, which, well, I think that's something we always have to talk about, and it's actually difficult because, yes, home is the dwelling, can be the neighborhood, can be the city, can be the nation. And for the second generation, what I found mostly, I think also what you said, it's actually the city or the neighborhood that is home. And the nation or citizenship also is more like it's a lottery. It doesn't really, you cannot control where you are born, so that's also why you don't necessarily use this to feel at home. Then about the second generation as well, something that Maurice pointed out recently is that in many cities, many European cities, we now have majority-minority neighborhoods. And I think that's very interesting to think about what is home and who defines home. Because there it's actually the people who have been there the longest are immigrants, guest worker immigrants, and their children. And if I think about places like Kreuzberg in Berlin, they are really, those are the established. And the newcomers are people, well, coming to Berlin to study, to work, whatever. And there it's really interesting, yeah, who defines home, who defines what is going on in public places. And it turns this relationship between migrants and the majority population. And what this also gives us the chance then is to think about other characteristics. So it's not only majority-minority society, but maybe there are other characteristics like age, length of residence, etc., that are important for homemaking. And I think that's something we should always think about because, yes, of course, in the book it's mostly about immigrants and majority society, but yes, there can be other characteristics. And my favorite example is a place in Kreuzberg, which is a place mostly for gay, for queer people, but at the same time it's in a Turkish neighborhood. So during the day you have old Turkish men sitting there having their coffee, and you would think they don't go to places like that, like stereotypically you would think that, but they do, and so they kind of mix with another population. So it's not always immigrants versus non-immigrants. And the last thing to think about the second generation is because Paolo in his book talks about remittance houses, and that's also interesting. What happens with these remittance houses when even the first generation might not actually go back, and what happens with them if they are inherited to the second generation, and how is the relation to the homeland? Two more short comments. When I read the book, I also thought about what home actually means in different languages. So English, yes, you have home. In Germany, we have the difference between Heimat and home. And I've done many interviews with the second generation, and even for them it was clear, Heimat is Turkey, but home is Berlin, for example. And it was fairly easy for them to make this difference. And we've just heard in another session that the concept of Heimat, how it's used politically, is also very, well, it's difficult, it's instrumentalized, but for people themselves, they can easily distinguish between Heimat, basically where they come from, and home, where they are living now. And in French, home is chez soi, which I don't even know how exactly to translate, at oneself, basically. So it's different ideas of home through these different languages. So I wondered, yeah, what can language actually tell us about what home means in different national contexts? And largely, you talk about methodology, and mostly saying that what we need are personal and biographical accounts that are multi-sided, to account for the transnational dimension. And while I support this, I'm still wondering, I think that in transnational studies we have so many case studies that don't necessarily speak to each other. And I was wondering, so if, in a sense, I think you are proposing these kinds of case studies, but what can we actually do that they are not tons of case studies, but that there is something more to it? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bilecen.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity also to talk about your book, which I love, and I can only join the club of loving the book. Well, let me start with why I really love the book. I will just make 3 quick points and then try to criticize the book. The first, I think the book has an innovative lens, starting from the concepts of home related to material and physical aspects and opening it up to different levels, including symbolic, emotional, relational, and political. The book has a great scope, having multiple levels of time, space, and political dimensions coming from a constructivist perspective. It does not only conceptualize homing as something fluid and open-ended process, as we have heard, and multi-sided, rather than thinking home as a sedentary and fixed entity. Homing, I quote you here from the conclusion, homing is defined as people's tentative ways of appropriating their everyday life circumstances and make them home-like, in light of their views and feelings of home, driven by claims of belonging and exerting control. I think the book makes larger claims of shedding light into the ongoing interaction processes of persons' geographical mobility and, as you've written, the appropriation of space through time between different populations and constellations of political climates. It also comes with guidelines on how to study home and homing at different levels of views, practices, and settings, with also 3 different research axes, namely the ways of constructing home, the ways of emplacing home, and the ways of circulating home. I really appreciate that it does not only come with this theoretical, solid background, but also having this recipe for the methodology, how to study home. And why I like my second point is that because when you have this title of this book, Migration and Home, then you would expect that it's only about migrants, but as we have also heard, that it also has to do with non-migrants. And I think so far in the literature of migration, we tend to focus a lot on migrants, and I really appreciate that you also put non-migrants there. And my third point, that what I really like, that throughout the book we acknowledge several inequalities. It does not only consider inequalities in terms of haves and have-nots, like resources to buy or construct a physical house, or its portability across borders based on person's education, social class, and social capital, as you write, but also in terms of access to such resources that making a difference in hierarchized society, such as access to housing market, welfare services, and employment. I really find your remarks on that fascinating. So, my points or criticisms, I have three points which are also in relation to what, as Christine also said. So to me, I understand that it is I think it can also, it should be in the curriculum of every migration taught. And still to me, it does not so much, all the time it does not very clear what type of mobility or what type of migration we're talking about. I see the effort that you differentiate between migrants and refugees in parts of the books, and to me, you also use the term extended mobility, and I was wondering what about the shorter term mobilities, like also the asylum seekers who live in limbo, and also international students that I've been also working on. So I was wondering where do then the temporary migrants or students who are in a country of education, what are their homing experiences? And the second point is that much resonates with the previous comment, that you also mention conflicted situations at home. And in general, in the book, I feel that home is depicted as a place or feeling of security that is an anchor for migrants, apart from the asylum seekers or refugees. But how does also homing look like for, say, I was also interested in second-generation migrants with abusive parents, or non-migrants with abusive parents, or say for the members of LGBTQI, and what other conflicts and tensions are there in migrants' homes or non-migrants' homes? I was wondering more about the conflicts and tensions. And my last point is about to the methods. also later in the conclusion you say that the book presents an overarching guideline on how to study home and homing empirically, and so it is clearly an interdisciplinary one. And what we suggest is a multi-sited and interdisciplinary method, usually or ideally using ethnographic methods such as go-along, participant observations, and interviews, life stories. So how it also look like from housing studies or architecture, so how could they all be combined? You also mentioned social network analysis at one sentence because of its relationality that you also talk. I was also wondering whether and how it could also be incorporated with other methods. And do you have a favorite chapter? That's my question.
Thanks very much. Basak.
Okay, I'm Paul Statham from the University of Sussex. The empirical indicator that I was curious about this book is that I actually bought it. So, you know, buying a hard copy book these days takes real motivation, right? So that was even before I was asked. So that can be taken as an indicator for my curiosity about what is going on here. Unlike the other people on the panel who are maybe insiders on this debate, I'm probably come from the direction of being the outsider. So for me, I'm curious about to what degree this debate is either going to remain internal to itself and be excellent within those terms, or to which you can actually talk to the mainstream or sociology or migration studies or whatever the target is, which would make it even more important. Okay, so first of all, a few comments about the book and where I see this research might fit in the field. I started with the definition of homing to open it up, which is exactly the same as the line that you picked out of the book. So, but I think it maybe deserves repeating. People's tentative ways of approaching their everyday life circumstances and making them home-like in light of their views and feelings at home. So I think that's actually, I think this is actually an important way to start to look at migration and migration studies. And I think it fits into some of the new work that has come, that I've come across in my job as a journal editor over the last 10 years that has a focus on emotions and the role of emotions in migration, which I think is an important development. A few other comments. First of all, it's an unusual book in terms of structure. It's short, it's about 100 pages, 6 chapters. So it's basically 5 essays, and each has an abstract. So in a sense, it doesn't have to flow like a normal kind of book, but okay, no problem with that so far. And it's basically an exposition on home in the context of mobility. And this is examined from many different perspectives. The book, in a sense, is a critical dialogue with other research. In this sense, at this stage, this project does not bring its own empirical data to the table very much. Instead, the data is clever things that other people have said about home, such as Stuart Ward, and many others. I think it's a very strong contribution. As I said, my own curiosity was sparked, and I think it fits into the new emphasis on emotions, immobility, migration, and migrants. One could argue that this was potentially brought in by gender studies, and also studies in other regions of the world other than the West, such as Southeast Asia, where the conventional ways of talking about, the clunky European way of talking about integration and migrants and stuff doesn't really fit with the way that migration in the world works. So I think that's, and so maybe the softening of these sort of old rational models that we've been applying in the West and looking outside, I think this is definitely the direction to go. I think it's an important strand of research that places the emphasis on migrants, their social relations, and their agency in the process. In short, it puts migrant lives as they experience back in the frame. So we're talking about lived experience. And I think moving forward, this is a very rich vein, and I think it's one that will make a contribution generally to migration studies. And I see it in the same light as the work that's recently been done by people like Francis Collins and Jürgen Carling, who have again beginning, focused on the role of desire and aspiration as kind of drivers of migration. I see Paolo's emphasis as home is his way of doing a similar kind of project. So the question though for me is, are we going to stay at very intelligent normative theory, quoting people who we like to read and this kind of thing, or is it going to be a research agenda that really gives new empirical information to the mainstream? And then I have, okay, this structure is always the same. You have to be nice and then you have to ask some questions. So here we go. Okay, the first isn't really a question, it's more a comment. The conclusion reads more like an introduction to perspective. It's almost the outline for a research proposal. So I think it makes claims for the validity of this approach, but this is only the first step. This obviously has to be verified by empirical research to go further. I think we can go there. But then I want to make a few general critical remarks across what this project may or may be, and it's a very broad brush for a very detailed and intricate book, but okay, we don't have much time, so here we go. The first is, again, is this just a normative project or is it a research agenda? So, one issue I have, is this a general theory of home? Yeah? Or is it unpacking specific context in which home is constructed and how homing is taking place? And in some places in the book, it reads very much like a general theory. In other parts, everything has to be dependent on context and be specific. So everything varies according to the specific type of migrant, the specific types of migration, and those kind of things to mention just two. So I think that needs, certainly when one transforms perspective into a research program and research design, those are obviously things you have to narrow down. And then is home the explanans or the explananda? So is home what is being explained by other factors, or is home the concept of homing doing the explaining of how migration takes place? Yeah, and again, in some places it seems to be doing one thing, in some places it seems to be doing another. And I think that's an interesting point. Then the other point I have, again, very general, is it working at the individual or the group level? So what is your unit of analysis? Quite often when I read it, it seems to be the individual, the movers, the natives, those left behind, which again are imaginative categories to take, and the ones that have not been taken before. But I think it's important to be clear about whether we're talking about individuals or whether we're talking about people who are located within groups, such as the family, which has been a unit of analysis that's been used in migration research. So which is it? Could be some of both, but how does that link together? The other question is one of scale, and this goes back to the question that's been raised along the panel of how home is actually used, and this goes back to thinking about whether we're talking about the individual level and what home means to individuals, or whether you're talking about patria, Heimat, are we going to stretch it to the nation state? Yeah, because we already have concepts to do national identity and various things like that. Of course, we know that right-wing populists use home in a certain way, but that's also nothing new. So, what is the scale where it makes most sense, and what can it do? And then, again, proof of the validity of the new concept is what added value it brings. And I think that there is added value there. As an enthusiastic outsider, I'm not quite sure what it is, and that's really your job to bring it home. But if we think about homing as you have it at the moment, we refer to three dimensions, which is relational infrastructure underlying and placement of home, so family and friends. So, what are you adding there to the theories on social capital? Yeah, that we already have. And then you talk about ideal home as a socio-cultural construction in migration. So how does that move beyond the idea of social imaginary that is used again generally in sociology? Then with resources and opportunities to achieve a decent home experience. So again, how does that move beyond opportunity structures? I want to know what the added value is of talking about home rather than doing the old stuff we've been doing for years. Yeah, I believe there is something there, and I don't yet understand what it is. A few minor points related to this is that the distinction between the sedentary and migrants, I find it in places exaggerated. So, for example, you stay, the bulk of sedentary people tend to perceive home as little more than a neutral background, which I think is, when my parents lived the same mile in the whole of their life, but their children moved around a lot, so they had this kind of experience. I imagine that's what you want to capture, and you will capture it. But then, maybe it needs to just be more carefully said. And the other thing is that you mentioned several times in the book life course, but then it doesn't really appear. So, if you're an old person, home means something very different than if you're a young person and you want to discover the world. Yeah? And that cross-cuts with being a migrant, not being a migrant. So, yeah, but I think there's a lot here. As I said, I bought the book. I'm enthusiastic about it. I have at home 90 deep biographical interviews with Thai women who married foreigners. And on one side, one extreme of the scale, you have Thai women who came to the UK, faced domestic violence, and then got taken into shelter, so then cut off from their Thai families and were just after money, so they have a sense of home. On the other side, you have the Thai women who married, got money, and then have transformed their village by building mansions with the like, kind of bling thing that a Premier League footballer would buy or something like that. And this is in a place where there's like wooden shacks and things like that. So they're materially transforming the home that they come from. So there's a lot of, I just wanted to say that I see a lot of way of using these wonderful conceptual insights. And yeah, so thank you for your contribution so far, and I look forward to seeing the end of the project.
Thanks much. My argument is not that I'd like more an open-ended relational processual view of home than a closed, essentialized one. Because I don't think there are only normative opposite claims at stake here. My argument is, as a sociologist, is that an essentialized, naturalized, nativist stance of home is empirically frail and ultimately not corresponding to the reality of facts out there. That's the only point. Whether I like it or not, I obviously don't, but that's not the issue here. My thing is to try and advance an empirically more sensitive and helpful frame to facilitate debate and more rigorous research on the topic. Because exactly for the powerful emotional and affective connotation that home holds, is more important to do rigorous empirical research on it rather than surrounding to the good or bad images that it channels throughout the populations in a given country. Then, so honored to be somehow, to some small extent, compared with the elaboration of such a general anthropologist as Gerd Baumann. That's probably a great, not necessarily deserved, but still a great compliment from me about that. Another point was, true, I did not expand as I could possibly, as I should have, on issues of racism, nor on the background pictures in terms of how deteriorating conditions in the labor market, in the housing market, do objectively negatively affect the scope for people to make themselves at home, whether for migrants or for natives or for whomever else. Now, on that I can just see the need for more research to be done about this. I can also see my own limitation as a micro-sociologist who is more fascinated with the fine-grained or single things than the overall picture, but there is clearly a need to expand more on this kind of connections. I do also see the relevance of a connection with the social reproduction theory. The point here is that on one hand there is an extended literature on how migrants as caregivers do affect in ways of another the sense of home of other people while sacrificing their own experience of home. It would be important to connect this further with the literature of home, because the key message is that homemaking has its own costs, and those costs are allocated in unequal ways among different groups. The very processes that enable some to make themselves at home may have an underside on the possibility to make themselves at home for different people. So once again, there are issues of inequality underlying what is only in appearance a peaceful and Swiss-like notion as a home. So again, thanks for all of these valuable insights you gave on the book. Now, on Christine, again, so happy that while she already made many great, insightful comments and criticism in the book review in the Journal of Housing and the Built Environment, she was able to write still more and better than that, so I'm twice grateful for that. Now, just picking up a few points. First and key point, I do acknowledge as a limitation of the book, the subtle temptation risk to over-idealize what migrants left behind as necessarily home-like, which is an absolutely open and contentious question to be addressed empirically. Now, I guess here there is some influence of my own background as a transnationalist, shaped and trained researchers. So much, I still believe, is fascinating and powerful in a transnational view of the world and of migrants. So much is also there the risk to over-idealize, to leave more space than necessary to the nostalgic ways of migrants, whereby whenever they do depict their home in the past, they often tend to, necessarily so, possibly to over-idealize the sweet, the inclusive, the home-like, while downplaying many more negative sides that home places clearly had. So there is clearly a risk here of over-identifying with the accounts of people rather than problematizing them in the first place, which is a typical risk, not for me, but for a number of ethnographers and qualitative interviews. We tend often to get so fond of what people say that we do not always appreciate as much as we should the distance between the accounts and the practices that lay behind what people say. Do long residents need to feel more at home? Not necessarily. Again, this is a great point. A very broad argument has been made, most notably in environmental psychology, on how a sense of home, as a matter of attaching routines of everyday life to a place, as a matter of making that place secure and predictable, has to do with the length of time space there, but this is obviously not and always necessarily the case, all the more so for underprivileged and stigmatized minorities such as the ones you were pointing to. Second generations are clearly not so important as in this book as they would deserve to. Here, my challenge was to try to advance a very broad and introductory approach to this topic, which necessarily sacrifices the special features of a number of distinctive emotional migration conditions, including the one of second generations which you have just mentioned. One more key point, two more key points actually. First, home critically varies in terms of whatever it means across languages, which is a fundamental data for all sorts of anthropological research on the topic, and a challenge for all of us who would like to do some comparative analysis rather than relying only on case studies, no matter how wonderful case studies may be. My way of approaching this is there can be more of a promising potential for comparison if we don't stick only to the literal, the language-based notion of homing, but we look also at a variety of social practices whereby people try to turn it into practice. So my counter-argument would be that the more we can turn the notion of home into observable social artifacts and practices, the more we can have a reasonable potential for comparative analysis, whatever the language label used to define it, and whatever the significant scope of variation between different notions in different languages. This is just a tentative point, but this is something that I guess can help to advance research on this topic. I'm not interested in doing only case study, if only because that's a more personal matter, but still it's important to acknowledge it here. This book was born actually as a sub-product, as an after-product of a research application for an ERC, for a European Research Council grant, which then I was lucky enough to get. So it's kind of a first starting point for the research project I'm currently involved in with a number of colleagues. So that's actually the position of that book in particular. Now, coming to Basak Bilecen's comments, many good things, again, but these are not necessarily the most interesting here. Going to the critical points. Again, not clear what type of migration I'm talking about. Agree. But this is, to me, a way of fixing at an abstract the state of the art. So much has been done and keeps being done on the specific, somehow specific experiences, ways of negotiating a sense of home, as related also to the condition of refugees, displaced people, people in limbo, international students. What I can do through a single book is just give some introductory maps, bearing in mind that all those who wish to expand that have to go much beyond what a single product can do at this stage. There are clearly distinctive features that have to do not only with the fact of being a student, a refugee, or whatever else, but more importantly, as some of you was pointing out, to the fact that migration background is only one of the factors that matter to what home means, to how far it can be achieved in practice. A number of social demographic factors that have to do with the age, position in the life course, education, social class, gender, and so forth are as, and sometimes, empirically speaking, more important. So again, nothing exhaustive there, but just an attempt to start with what in a pivot format in 50,000 words can be achieved. Lots of more of this could be done also by enhancing the connection with the housing studies, as you were rightly pointing out, with the architecture and with many more realms. The fact that I did not has basically to do with my own limitations. I'm pretty ignorant, regrettably, in housing studies, not to mention the other fields you pointed to. Again, there is a potential to move beyond, but within the scope of one book, I just had to pick up a few things for my own taste to some extent too. Now, getting to Paul Statham, again, I hope you didn't repent yet of all the money you had to spend for this book. I hope you didn't, but that's a hope from my side. I understand you didn't from the variety of good things you said actually. Now, again, this book is a state-of-the-art preliminary to an ongoing research project, which is part of the reason why the original empirical material is not there yet. The idea is that there has been a huge amount of literature on these topics, but 90% of it in terms of individual case studies that not always speak to each other as they could and possibly as they should. So my idea was to try to map at a certain point how and where we are. Okay, so is getting to the critical points which open up fantastic and huge questions that I am unable to address now, if only to a very limited extent, but they are still clear out there. this is, to me, a research agenda, a way to, I wouldn't say open up, well, I did say in the ERC project open up a field because I was supposed to play the act of the grand guy. I apologize for that, but in the book the thing is, it's better if we connect a variety of pieces of literature than if we leave them separated. It is clearly not yet the case of a substantive theoretical argument in its own right. I hope to reach at that point after this project, possibly by engaging with more dialogue with a number of colleagues too. Is home the explanans or the explanandum? I would like it to be the explanandum only, because I do realize that whenever I start from it, only we have a risk to essentialize it, to give it for granted, which cannot be the case unless to a very limited account. I worked for the sake of simplicity, of simplification, actually mostly at an individual level, but it's clearly important to most people, to a number of migrants maybe even more, that at least the family level is what matters more in practice, which again is a matter to see how home feelings, constructions and practices are very much a contentious topics that vary along life course, but also depending on the position and the responsibility one has within the structure of a family. What is the very big ultimate question? What is the conceptual value added, if any, we do have here? I would dare very tentatively respond for now that the value added I personally argue to see in this kind of project compared with the elaboration on social capital, on social imaginary, on opportunity structure and so forth, at least to some extent, is that expanding on the people's experiences of home brings all of these debates to not just to a micro level of analysis, but to an in-place level of analysis, as long as all that has to do with home does not float in the air, but is critically affected to a specific condition of placemaking, to particular material, cultures, environments that, however we may be fond of globalization, mobility, blah, blah, are still there and are, to most people, I would say, in critical need for them to attach a degree, at least, of sense of home or and homely enough environment around their everyday lives. My view of what an added value is primarily related to the persisting importance of some form of emplacement, even when the focus is primarily on social relationships, on aspirations towards the future or recollections of the past, and so forth. Why life course has not been expanded as it should, again, is both something connected to the format of the book and to my own lack of specific skills on that, but again, I would like this to work out as an argument for these topics to be interesting enough to deserve more than they have been done so far. And I hope from the conversation to follow that this shows up to be the case. So again, thanks very much for all of these comments, and I would be very happy and curious now to expand the comment to whomever wishes to step in.